Hello, my name is Ben Ferling. I'm a senior communication studies major and political science minor at the College of Worcester. I'm very excited to be presenting my independent study today. Thank you so much for joining me. I was advised in this independent study by Dr. Atai in the Communication Studies Department. And so, with that, I'll be going into a little bit of what my research was about, the purpose behind it, my findings, and everything like that. With that, this is cashing in on Kaepernick, a visual ideological analysis of the commodification of racial equity and inclusion in Nike's equality and Just Do It advertising campaigns. This research asks, how have companies or corporations intervened in and commodified social controversy? Specifically, the study aims to analyze the strategies used by Nike to commodify racial equity and inclusion as a social justice concept or social controversy in two of their advertising campaigns, Just Do It and Equality. In these, there are a lot of notable things going on, such as the inclusion of professional athletes such as LeBron James, Serena Williams, and Kevin Durant. Other individuals in here include Megan Rapinoe, United States soccer player, Dirk Nowitzki, former NBA player for the Dallas Mavericks, as well as Kevin Hart, professional comedian. There are three rationales behind this study. First, my research builds on scholarly works that examine the influence of capitalist ideologies and advertising on society. Advertising, now more than ever, is one of the biggest ways in which capitalism can operate through corporations and their viewers, or anybody, frankly, who can listen. Thus, it's important to be studied. Second, my takes a differentiating approach from previous research. Instead of examining one social controversy and how over time it has historically been commodified by different organizations and corporations, my research examines one corporation, in this case Nike, in its continuous commodification of one social controversy, in this case racial equity and inclusion. Third, my research showcases the prevalence of these commodified social controversies, such as racial equity and inclusion, in both campaigns. This is a quite important issue, and thus it should be researched. Another thing about this is that when we see corporations say commodifying the same issue in their advertising campaigns, such as racial equity and inclusion, it shows that they work. Therefore, they are profiting off of these social controversies, such as racial equity and inclusion. Thus, they should be researched even more in depth. Next, we'll take a look at some of the literature that is relevant into understanding my research. I first start off with a section about ideology, where I specifically take a definition from Karl Marx and his work in the German ideology, where he defines ideology as a connection or a collection of ideas that allows man to properly function, think, conceptualize, and other things pertaining to ideas. I then go into a couple of different sections, starting with neoliberalism, which is defined by David Harvey. I take his work and we specifically look at how neoliberalism is the expansion of the economy, as well as other things such as private property rights, free trade, the free market, and things like that, and how that ultimately leads to human well being. And that's kind of the way of approaching neoliberalism and how it works to manage capitalism. I then continue and take work from Wendy Brown. Wendy Brown is an esteemed communication scholar who does a great job writing extensively about neoliberalism, how it came about, as well as its issues in society. And she really articulates that under neoliberalism, a way to manage capitalism, humans are seen less as individual citizen actors and more as simply just economic actors. Their individualism is almost taken away in a sense. Next, I take a look at the ideas of capitalism and commodification, specifically criticized by communication scholars. I take an article specifically from Christian Fuchs and Laura Monticelli, and their work on talking about capitalism and commodification, how it really obliterates, that's one of the best words that they use, it obliterates the way that we think about the economy and human interaction as two components that interact with one another, and really seeing that profit and sales are really the things that make the biggest difference and are the number one priority in capitalism. I then look at neo-Marxism, or the new approach to Marx's ideas on labor, commodification, exploitation, and work, and ideas like that. Specifically, I take work from Lacour, who writes all about these ideas that I just mentioned. One important thing that I think is really important to take note of, that Marx has a huge impact on this section, and so a lot of his communication scholars believe that Karl Marx didn't really care about communication as a discipline. This really was not the case. I think today more than ever we're seeing that communication is closely tied to ideas of labor and exploitation, and thus Marx really did care and still is part of this conversation that we're having today. Next, I move into a section on consumer culture and advertising strategy, two things that really do have a symbiotic relationship that work together. I first use an example of Andy Warhol. I'm a huge fan of his work and his art specifically, and I think that it's really important to kind of use him as an example, one of this
best known to his audiences is the Campbell's soup can, which is a huge example of consumer culture and advertising strategy through the past. Andy Warhol knew that consumer culture was a very, very important concept, and not only did it do its job of selling products, but it also made an effect on people and caused them to think a certain way. And so Andy Warhol typically would put brands and culture into his art, not just images, paintings, pictures, and things like that. I then move into a section all about consumer culture, particularly in a United States context, with work by Mike Featherstone. And he talks about how people who embrace consumer culture and actively are part of consumer culture are seen as some of the best people in America, or the truest Americans, as you could see in an American context. Then I go into a really unique section on advertising strategy where I outline 6 advertising strategies that I think are most prevalent in advertisements, commercials, and things like that in our market today. If you were to watch 10 advertisements, 9 out of 10 times, you'll probably see something like this in at least one of those advertisements. And so I think going forward, looking at some of these advertisements by Nike that we are going to see in a little bit, it's really important to kind of consider these and think of how they're going to be prevalent in the advertisements that Nike provides. Continuing on with my literature review, I take a look at corporate activism, specifically examples in the past of other corporations intervening and commodifying other social controversies. The first one that I take a look at, and perhaps the most prevalent, is the Benetton Group, a fashion company with the United Colors of Benetton campaign, which released in the 1980s to 1990s, meant to showcase world issues going on around the world to their customers. Issues such as war, child deaths, and poverty were just a couple of the issues showcased in their advertisements in the United Colors of Benetton campaign. Not only was their goal in this line to sell their product, it was also to bring people together through these issues. However, it was met with a lot of controversy, as the images in their advertisements really were just these photos that I mentioned of things such as war and death, just with their logo in the bottom corner. There was no real advocacy going on in these advertisements, which is a big missed point. Sarah A. Tenick was one of a couple scholars that really wrote extensively on this and why this is a huge issue, and people are not really providing any solvency in their ads, really just trying to make a quick buck or two off of these social issues. Second is the Product Red campaign, in which corporations would participate in this by creating red products meant to counteract the idea of AIDS in specific African countries. Areas that this was really, really prominent in was, for example, Apple would make a red iPhone, or Target, for example. Target, as written by Bell in her article on the Product Red campaign, would use their trademark logo and trademark color of red to really, really promote this further with a lot of their red products. Lastly, I take a look at Nike, my research artifact specifically. First, I take a look at Bankston's work on analyzing the timeline of Nike. For example, their first endorsement of an athlete, tennis player Ilan Staste, in the 1800s all the way now into Michael Jordan, arguably the greatest basketball player of all time. Notably, Jordan was one of the first athletes to still be endorsed by Nike, but was the first African American athlete to do so, which marked a big, big turning point in the endorsement of African American culture, players, and athletes specifically. Next, I take a look at Nike's engagement to controversy. Nike is not new to this issue, like a lot of other global corporate brands. They're very much caught up into the controversy of sweatshop labor, which Dabil writes about extensively, in which Nike did a very, very poor job of providing the right working situations for a lot of their workers, and they did really needed to improve this, but they really didn't to an extent, which is where the court case of Nike versus Mark Caskey comes into play. Igelko writes extensively on this, and where the San Francisco native Mark Caskey wrote about how Nike lied about the ideas and the things that they were providing for their workers specifically, such as a low wage and bad working conditions. Nike really did this to improve their corporate face, or the way that people perceived them, but they really weren't making overall change anywhere, in which this case got brought to the Supreme Court, in which Mark Caskey argued that Nike lied, but Nike really just said that, we're really just doing this in the terms of advertisement, and they got away with it because corporations have the same right of speech as individuals do. Lastly, there's another controversy, which is my research artifact, specifically the Equality and Just Do It advertising campaigns. Sarah Bennett Weiser and Henry Zerner are two of a couple of thousands of people who have voiced their opinions on issues such as equality and Just Do It. People like Sarah Bennett Weiser and Henry Lerner believe that these advertisements are just another example on a long timeline of corporations and advertising strategies and campaigns that have really just meant to make a quick buck off of social controversies, offering anything near solvency to these issues. Next, I take a look at my methodology that I use to employ my research. Specifically, my research takes a look at rhetorical criticism, and specifically underneath that, a visual ideological analysis. What I'm doing is analyzing visually, looking at visual aids for advertisements. That's what I mean by ad count underneath. For advertisements in the ideologies that Nike puts behind them. We're going to see some of these advertisements here in just a second, but that's kind of the purpose of what I'm going for here. I'm looking for what ideologies is Nike trying to communicate to their audiences, and how are they doing that visually specifically. I'm also going to take a look at some analysis questions here in a minute, and one of them that I ask is the visual communication techniques that Nike employs. How do they plan on putting their ideologies, such as we mentioned with our definition from Marx, a collection of ideas or beliefs or concepts, how does Nike put those behind visual aids such as images, pictures, people, actions, etc.? We're going to check that out in just a minute. I additionally incorporate Arthur Asperger's interpretation of the Laswell formula into my research as well. The Laswell formula is one of the best ways of viewing communication as a train between two people in the idea of communication methodology. The Laswell formula specifically asks who says what to who through what medium for what gain. It's a collection of about 4 or 5 questions that go right after one another that intend to see who is speaking to who about what for what reason. Berger's interpretation of this takes it to the next level, which really helped my research. Berger looks at it at more of an artistic standpoint in the sense of who says what through what means visually with what goal in mind or to what end. So this is a really great way of looking at how Nike plans on saying what they want in their corporate ideologies to their consumer through their visual means of advertisement, and then to what end, in which I'm saying is the commodification of racial equity and inclusion. As previously mentioned in my methodology slide, there are 4 advertisements that I'm taking a look at today. 1 print and 1 commercial from the Equality campaign, and 1 print and 1 commercial from the Just Do It campaign. Additionally, presented before you are 5 analysis questions that I used myself to see how Nike specifically commodifies racial equity and inclusion in all of their advertisements. You can read these right here. For the sake of time, I'm showing some screenshots from the Equality commercial. I'm not able to show them from all of our advertisements, but I do want people to take a note of these, as they were some of the images that I looked at in my advertisements, as well as some of the images that I thought were the most influential. As you're taking your time to look through these, ask yourself a couple questions. Why is there a police car in the top left corner? What does that relate to the other bodies in the image? Why are there dripping wet white cars in the bottom left image? What does that do, and why are there people running behind them? Who's the person in the top right photo? For reference, it's NBA player Kevin Durant of the Brooklyn Nets. Why does that matter? Take a look at these and take some ideas for yourself. What do these mean? Why could I possibly be analyzing these? And what examples of racial equity and inclusion are prevalent in these ads? In this slide are the 2 print advertisements from the Equality and Just Do It advertising campaigns. Both of them have notable bodies, in the Just Do It having the face of Colin Kaepernick, whom they had just endorsed, as well as in the Equality ad having about 16 athletes and notable bodies who are imaged below. A couple things to take note of. Who is present in these ads? Who's not present in these ads? What does the effect of color have to do? In the bottom image, there are individuals of American descent, European descent, as well as those from African American descent. What is the advertising strategy of Nike recoloring their faces to all seem more equal? What could that possibly have to do with racial equity and inclusion and the commodification of it? After spending extensive time analyzing these advertisements, I come to 4 major findings. The first is the use of notable bodies. Not only does Nike use famous bodies such as Colin Kaepernick, LeBron James, Kevin Durant, Kevin Hart, and Serena Williams, Nike also uses bodies that catch the eye of their audiences, specifically a potential buyer of Nike's products. This could be people of diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds, but also people with disabilities or any other type of marginalized identity that could normally not be seen in a stereotypical ad. Second is that neoliberal rhetoric cultivates neoliberal advertisements. As mentioned in my ideology section, neoliberalism works. It's a way to manage the current economic situation that the United States is in this sense, capitalism. And so, neoliberal rhetoric does cultivate neoliberal advertisements, or advertisements that select that neoliberalism is a successful way of arguing that capitalism works in our community. Third, Nike definitely amplifies advertising strategy as outlined in my chapter 2. They take those 6 points and they turn them up to an 11 in the sense that you're able to see all of the ideas that they talk about in terms of coloring their advertisements. They use a lot of color. They use a lot of notable bodies, as like I mentioned in my first point. They also talk about corporate social responsibility. They talk about their company doing the right thing always and showcasing product benefits. If you're wearing a Nike product, not only will you feel good, but you'll do the most good by promoting these ideas of equality, equity, and inclusion. Fourth, like I mentioned, Nike does a great job of coloring their advertisements. They use color in a lot of clever ways to make it appealing to the customer. Not only do they use black and white, like previously shown, to show this serious divide between black and white, which does have historical implications in an American context, they also use color when it comes to showing off these bodies, or in the Just Do It advertisement, just everyday life and how color can be so prevalent in how we view others. Lastly is my conclusion and some things to take away from this presentation, as well as some stuff that I took away from this research. First, Nike definitely has a serious intent in mind to revolutionize two things. First of all, Nike seriously wants to revolutionize the way that corporations market their products. They think that showing their product to people is not enough anymore, and thus they should take advantage of the current things that are going on outside of our houses and in the real world, such as these social controversies. Second, Nike seriously wants to revolutionize how we perceive and form opinions on advertisements. They want us to think about these ads and not only just buy their product, and so they're putting these very controversial issues in front of us. Although Nike tries to revolutionize these things, Nike also falls flat in a couple of senses, like I mentioned in my couple slides ago about how they fall victim to traditional advertising strategies. Not only do they use some of these, they even bring in some other ones that you could just see as bland. However, this does work in their favor. When you're viewing a advertisement in a more traditional sense, you're more so just looking for the product or what makes Nike unique from other corporations, and not really the subtle hints of racial equity and inclusion that they're really turning into this marketable product. Second, this takes place in one of my largest limitations, but also is prevalent throughout the advertisements themselves. Nike certainly takes advantage of the fact that they have a huge audience, a huge consumer base, and that they are a global corporate powerhouse. We can see this in a couple ways. First of all, we can see this in the ad count. Like I mentioned in my methodology, I only have 4 advertisements to take a look at. This is because that's all really Nike needs. They don't need 8 to 10 to 12 to 14 to 16 advertisements to get the word out. They really need 4. Some on TV, which are later put onto YouTube, and some in print that are seen in magazines and billboards, and that's all they need to get the word out. They see a swoosh or the word Nike, Just Do It, and that's all consumers need to know to tie a product or an idea or an ideology to a name, such as Nike. Second, we see this in their willingness to release ads. Nike has certainly been a pioneer in advertising the ideas of social controversies, specifically ones related to sports or stuff that's happened in the 2010s up to now. The willingness to release these signifies not only are they confident in their ads, but they're confident that they're not going to diminish their consumer base to an extensive amount because of these controversial ideas. Nike has certainly seen some pretty dark stuff, such as people cutting off the Nike swoosh of some socks or burning some Nike jerseys. However, it's not going to hurt them so much in the long run because they are this global corporate powerhouse. I do want to end, however, by saying that despite Nike's shortcomings, this is a step in the right direction. They did want to revolutionize the way that we advertise our products and the way that we form opinions on advertisements. We might not have changed our view on this an incredible amount. However, this is the right direction towards more ethical, more equitable, and more inclusive marketing techniques. With the work of Nike, we're able to see more of these kind of advertisements that are more equitable in today's world. And hopefully we will eventually reach a point in which neoliberalism and advertisements do not need to be tied together in a sense that is unethical and unfair to marginalized communities. With that, I do want to say thank you for joining me in my presentation today of my independent study. It was an incredible experience and something that I've really appreciated, and I hope you're able to pick up that I was very passionate about a topic like this. I look forward to answering your questions on this in a little bit. So again, thank you so much for joining me again. And my name is Ben Ferling, and again, thank you for joining me. Bye-bye.